everyone. To wherever you may be streaming in the world, I hope you're having a wonderful Friday. We're here in Montreal. I'm here with Dr. Michael Teed, and he is from Halifax, and he's going to be talking to us today about mental health at the workplace with the management training that he does. I'm really, really excited for our conversation. Dr. Michael Teed, he obtained his Ph.D. in Industrial and Organizational Psychology from St. Mary's University in Halifax. And now he's at Bishop's University, where he holds the position of professor in the business department. We just talked a bit earlier before this, and he's very passionate about helping people develop themselves academically, professionally, and personally. He teaches at Bishop, so his courses include organizational behavior, training and development, interpersonal skills, leadership, among others. And what we'll be talking about more today is his work on a 3-year research project where he examined the implementation of the Mental Health Commission of Canada's national standard with 43 participating organizations. This study was one of the first of its kind done in the world, and it really looked at the effectiveness of a variety of tools and resources intended to promote mental health and prevent psychological harm at work. So Dr. Teed, welcome to our LinkedIn Live today.
It's really great to be here, Vivienne. Thanks so much for having me, and I'm really excited to talk to people. And hi, Justin.
Great. So maybe we can get this started off with talking about this 3-year study. I'm sure you have lots of thoughts that come to your mind about all the work you did on this, but maybe you could tell us a bit more about that. What did you find, and what was most challenging about this study?
I love this study. It was really, really interesting. And just to kind of hook it up into a sense where we can link it to an applied setting, like if you think about yourself and you think of who you know who struggled with mental health issues, it could be yourself, it could be family members, friends, colleagues. I typically start all my talks on mental health with this and ask people to raise their hands. All the hands go up, right? And then when I follow through with the question of, well, you know, how equipped are you to actually deal with mental health? What training do you have? That's when you see all the hands go down.
Yeah.
So if you're looking at mental health in Canada, we lose about $51 billion a year due to mental health, like linked to absenteeism and performance. So the idea of the standard was really to help provide a framework for organizations to tackle mental health at work. So we followed over 40 companies for 3 years. So the first year was the baseline, second year was interim, and the third year was actually just the final year to see if there was any improvements based on this standard. The standard looked at different pillars. So it looked at commitment and policy making, the planning, how you actually implement, evaluate and corrective action, and going about reviewing it. So we tracked this for 3 years, a phenomenal experience. And what was really interesting is we had companies that were small, medium, large, private, and public. So you really got to see how each one of them tackled things a little bit differently with the resources they actually had.
Wow.
So I think what we picked up on is change can happen.
Yeah.
It's just slow, right? So if you got the mentality that this is a race and I need to get this done, it might not be an accurate expectation. But if you're going really slow, you know, and you're taking your wins and as you go and you're building them as momentum, you can actually see some difference over the years. It was really fun to watch that and really stimulating.
Wow.
Yeah.
Cool. And were these organizations having some kind of training, or were you just seeing organically what they did to address mental health at work?
So each organization did it completely differently based on the commitment and the policies they had, right? And what we discovered is some policies that were there, they worked, or they didn't work, right? Because a policy is great, but if it's written and it's hidden and no one sees it and you're not implementing it properly, well, then it's not really that worthwhile.
Right.
So, you know, so it was kind of neat to see how companies would tackle it and what challenges they face. So for example, the large companies, which had limited resources, really struggled with how do I get this message across consistently from Halifax all the way to Vancouver, right? And while, meanwhile, smaller ones were, okay, well, I'm really limited for resources. You know, we're only a 30 size company. I'm trying to do compensation. I'm trying to do recruitment. I'm trying to do selection. Now we're participating in this. I really believe it's important, but I'm doing this on the side of my desk, right? So you can see how each company was a little bit different, but I think it's finding what their fit is.
Yeah. And I think they have different challenges, as you said, where large companies may be trying to get that message across, and small companies, it's with all the things they have to do, it's another extra thing that they have on their plate.
Oh yeah, for sure. And I mean, when you think of the large companies, well, then you've got leadership that's spread out all throughout the country. Is the message going to continuously be the same? Is it going to be consistent with your core values of what mental health means for your company?
Yeah.
Some of the larger ones, we saw deviations, right? Companies that were highly resourced, that had sufficient staff, and the resources outweigh the demands, no problem at getting this done. Other locations where the resources were low and the demands were really high, maybe the mental health wasn't a priority.
Right.
You can kind of see those shifts, right?
Yeah, that's interesting. And thinking about resources, I think that's a main challenge a lot of companies perhaps bump up against of, we're constrained, we have a certain mental health budget. How do I best optimize that budget for the resources my people actually need? So, in looking at all the resources companies use, what would you say were the most effective tools and resources that companies used, that you found, if they had a small budget, how could they use this best?
Yeah, so it was really, really interesting, Vivienne, working with those small companies, and they use different techniques. And the key thing when you're dealing with mental health and you're trying to advance in a new area, try, right? You have to try to figure out what works and what doesn't work. Some of the smaller companies, what they did was super amazing. They actually developed informal networking units. So where 3 or 4 of these groups would actually meet together on a monthly basis and say, hey, look, we're limited for resources. I'm kind of struggling with absenteeism. We're getting into shorter days. It's dark. Depression rates seem to be going up. These are little things that I tried, right? And some companies was the cheapest initiatives. Let's spend $30 on a whiteboard. Let's put it in the break room. And for the next 2 weeks, let's actually say, okay, well, we've got this issue. We're evolving how we're going to manage our stress. Let's see what our employees think. And this was a really cool way that's like low-lying fruit, right? Because you're basically giving it to your employees. The management's pitching that they're involved in this and they're engaged. Write down your perceptions of what you think would work. And from that, obviously, there's some things that it wouldn't work. It was too expensive. But within that, oh, well, this is kind of neat. I didn't think of this. And this is something, you know what? We don't need a lot of resources or money to do. So it's a real good mix that's actually there.
And I think that's really powerful, a really good message, that it doesn't have to have a lot of money behind it. It doesn't have to be something super complicated. I love what he said about the small networking events that happened. And I think oftentimes when you think mental health, we think, okay, we need to have this big EAP where, someone's depressed, we need to give them like a 10-step program. And it's not really that complicated all the time. So I love that,
Yeah, and Robert had a really good comment. Like, you can't really, it can't just be chunked into one area. And we saw, Vivienne, I know we talked about this prior, but trying to find some challenges. Some of the challenges is people are just overwhelmed. So if I'm an HR and you're dumping all this on my desk, will it be effective? Yeah, maybe a little bit. But obviously, if you give me a full resources and you put someone in that position, that's their job to completely focus on the psychological health aspect, look, you're going to build definitely more momentum.
Right. Yeah, and talking about effective and non-effective tools, how do you think workplaces can ensure that their tools are working? Like, are there ways to track that? What did you find companies did to track how well their tools were working?
Yeah. So we, a few weeks ago, Jim Dearnoff, I think my colleague was here, maybe not a few weeks ago, but some time ago. So when we go in the companies and we try to do work related to mental health and that psychological well-being, where we're helping companies identify kind of pressure points and we're trying to be proactive in what they can actually do moving forward. We always look at multiple data sources. And I think it's important. And you could see companies did that pretty well. So it's finding a tool that's valid and reliable that fits your company. But the data alone is not going to be sufficient. So we'll look at quarterly reports on benefits and health, and we'll see, okay, well, how much money is going towards antidepressants? How many people are out on sick leave? Then you compare it up to absenteeism days, short-term disability, long-term disability. But those are just numbers, and the numbers don't tell a story. Yeah. So then it comes down to actually doing interviews and actually doing focus groups. But now what's really neat is you've got all this data, then you can supplement it with these really interesting qualitative comments. Right. And then so suddenly what happens is when you're pitching it to your company, you're removing away from the numbers and you're basically telling these stories that are really, well, they're impactful and they're really emotional. And I think that just drives the data even more, and it helps personalize it. So to your question, I would say use multiple data points.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. I think the quantitative and the qualitative part really complement each other. And I'm going to ask you a question that's vague and maybe will be open to interpretation by different people, but I would like to know your opinion in when you did these interviews and focus groups. Did you find that there were common characteristics of a healthy versus unhealthy workplace? And how did that emerge, not just with the data and the sick leaves, but in the qualitative data? Was there kind of patterns that you observed?
Yeah, the patterns, there's definitely patterns that showed up. So the good organizations, you typically tend to have leaders that were transformational leaders in nature. They were really trying to get their companies to go to a whole new spot with respects to mental health and psychological health.
Huh.
They really displayed attributes of, you know what, this is my story for mental health. We've been in some companies where they've lost family members due to suicide. So when they're talking about this, there's a real passion that's there, and they know that they can have an impact.
Yeah.
And they'll have open door policies. If you're struggling, I actually want to hear from you because I really care about you, right? So for me, I think what I find is that does make a difference in comparison to other companies where it's a flavor of the month and it's just for show. Mental health is really important to my company. You know, I really value it. Well, then we had a lot of directors that tried to make meetings with those CEOs only to be told, I don't have the time for this. It isn't important. Reach out to me in 2 to 3 months. Yeah. Other things that we've heard from employees, well, you know, if mental health is so important to them, why do we only have one mental health day a year to focus on it?
Yeah.
Right? And it's true, because when you put it in that perspective, if it's just one day a year, is it really that important? So the best ones are actually having these continued discussions. The best ones are using grassroots techniques where it's a small company. Okay, we've got, you know what, we've got an employee that their parents are going through dementia. Well, as a group, what can we do to facilitate that? Well, why don't I call some nonprofits that actually help support people with dementia, and let's see if we can actually get some literature. So some organizations even had tables for people that were going through cancer, dementia, tons of different things where the resources are relatively, you know, they're not crazy expensive to do. I don't know, does that answer your question, Vivienne?
Yeah, no, that's really good. I think one point that you brought up, characteristic, it really boils down to the managers and culture. And I think managers are the primary people responsible for building a team culture. So if you have a manager who's passionate about finding the resources for their team, I think you hit it on the nail. And that would really make a difference, which kind of brings me to the question I see in the chat Saba asked, which is how can we help managers? Because a lot of managers just are not equipped to face the daily challenges, she says. So like you have someone who shows up, you know, they say, I need to take leave, I'm experiencing depression. Like, what do you do as a manager? How can we help managers to deal with these situations?
So you know what, I saw that question in the chat, and I was actually hoping we were going to get at it, because I think it's a really commonality that we've seen with a lot of managers and companies. And I teach organizational behavior at Bishop's. We have one class on mental health. And for many of the students that are going through that business degree, this is going to sound awful. That hour and a half through 4 years, that's it. Unless you're taking an occupational health and safety class, that's not enough to demonstrate the importance of it. So the key thing I would say is, you know, if you are trying to help your employees, listen to them. Show them that you care. You're not a psychologist. You don't have to be. They're not assuming you are. But if you notice your employees are off, be proactive. Go to them. You know, hey, Vivienne, I noticed today you kind of showed up late. You don't seem to be quite as enthusiastic the last few weeks. Is everything okay? Right. Oh, no, you're struggling at home. Okay, well, you know what? Hey, we've got these resources that are available. Have you considered looking at them? Yeah. Right. So it's not often, I think, the people we've seen and we met, sometimes they're fearful of having these discussions, kind of in a sense like, well, I don't want to poke the bear and make it worse for them. I don't want to embarrass them about this. That might all be personal stuff. But if you're a true leader and you really care for your employees, maybe we should be having these discussions, right? Not in a judgmental way, just focusing on behaviors and saying, hey, look, I care. Is everything okay? Yeah.
And I think just opening up that space for people to say, okay, I can talk about this. I'm allowed to talk to my manager about this situation, I think is so key.
Yeah, like, you know, and when I'm looking at some really good leaders that are in this, they're really vulnerable. Yeah. They themselves will say, you know what, I really struggled with mental health. Right. And they use that, and not everyone's comfortable with that. That's fine. You don't, you know, if you're comfortable with it, you expressing that you face challenges with this and you're able to overcome them could probably increase the likelihood that they'll approach you when they're struggling. because they recognize something normal that you've gone through yourself.
Yeah, I think that's a great call to action to end on. Is I think we're all struggling with this in some way, and I think if you are a manager, knowing how to be vulnerable first and setting that example, I think, is a powerful thing to do. It doesn't have to be complicated. I think what you said, Dr. Teed, about just saying, you know, this is me too. Like, I struggle with this. It's not just you. And I think as an employee, what would you say to an employee, perhaps, who's working in struggling with mental health in a company?
Like, I'm here to help you and I'm here to listen. Is there anything I can do to support you at the time being? Like, you know, let's take a look at what's within my control that I can actually do to help you out.
Yeah.
And I think these are simple discussions. And some employees that we discovered, they didn't even know they had an EAP program. They didn't know they had access to these resources.
Yeah. Right.
Right. They're struggling kids, like, you know, adolescents. And let's be frank, life is really hard. It's been exceptionally hard over these last few years. When I mentioned that, you know, we lose 51 billion a year in Canada revenues related to mental health. That's pre-COVID. The HR reporter a few weeks ago said that short-term disability claims last year alone were up 75%.
Oh, wow. It's only going to grow.
So if we can get an understanding that, you know what, life's hard, maybe we need to listen and be empathetic and see what we can do to help people. Even the littlest things can make a difference.
Right.
I'll give you one example. It's an education example, but you can easily use it within a work area context. I had a student that was struggling in class, wasn't in class for 3 weeks, sent an email saying, "Hey, I noticed you haven't been in class. Is everything okay? This isn't like you. Is there anything I can do to support you?" That student came to me afterwards saying, "You know how meaningful that was for me, that you noticed and you actually took the time of your day to reach out and check in on me. That completely meant the world."
Huh.
So sometimes these little actions, right, they do make a big difference.
Right. No, that's wonderful. And I think we can, to summarize our discussion, since we have reached 15 minutes, is, you know, I think Dr. Chidi brought a really good conclusion on that. It doesn't need to be complicated. It can be these simple things of reaching out, of showing that you care. And I think that we all need some of that. So thank you, Dr. Teed, again, for just sharing a bit of your knowledge with us and for the work that you're doing with mental health at the workplace in Canada. We really appreciate it and wish you all the best in your work.
Much appreciated. Thanks for the platform, for letting me talk about something I'm so passionate about.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for being here.